Chapter 10. On the back of a truck piled high with burlap grain bags, I reached the border of Afghanistan. The shabbiness of the immigration post signaled the poverty of the nation. Yet the immigration officials offered a cordial welcome, quite different from most other border guards I'd experienced. My first stop in Afghanistan was Herat. The people here were charming and friendly. In the stark desert terrain, they wore raggedy, dusty clothing and lived in shambled dwellings. Although they were the poorest people I had seen in my travels yet, everyone I passed offered a smile, and no one asked me for anything. On the contrary, they were eager to share what little they had. Each day in Herat, I was invited into their homes. Usually a family lived in a hut of one small room. They joyfully shared their flat bread with me. My hosts could neither read nor write, yet so many of them struck me as both humble and wise, living with dignity through the tribulations of their lives. Although they spoke not a word of English, the communication of the heart that we shared was especially satisfying to me. On a winter day in 1970, in a small tea stall in Herat, I wrote a letter home. Hello, my family. How is life? I am now in Herat, Afghanistan. It is amazing to be here in a country with people that are naturally friendly and humble, poor but peaceful. I know it is late, but I will still wish happy birthday to Dad and Larry. I wish you the very best of everything. With love, Richard. Early one morning, I innocently set out to explore the town of Herat and stumbled into a neighborhood unlike any I had ever experienced. It was late morning as I stood on a dusty roadside and observed my surroundings, at first enjoying the sights. Looking around, I was transported into a realm of timeless simplicity. My heart pounded. Camel after camel sauntered by. There were no sounds of horns or modern vehicles, only camel hooves clacking on an earthen road. Families were crowded into tiny one-story houses made of dried mud. A pungent taste of arid dust dried my mouth, and the smell of camel excrement and burning wood assaulted my nose. People chatted while squatting on the roadside, dressed in their traditional Afghani clothing. Their loosely fitting garments were elegant, though faded and tattered with wear. Men wrapped long sheets of cloth around their heads as turbans, and many had faces riddled with deep blotches, scars made by smallpox. Like aged leather, their skin was dried and toughened by the elements, and huge spontaneous smiles revealed rotting or missing teeth. Baggy shirts extended below their knees as they performed their chores, apparently with no concern for time. Women covered their faces with a fine mesh and wore blue or black gowns that reached from the top of their heads down to the ground, leaving no trace of their bodies visible. A blind man sat on the road singing religious songs in a high voice as he thumped the skin of a drum. It was cold, but smoke from cooking fires filled the air. Suddenly, Quite unexpectedly, I was literally brought to my knees by culture shock. My eyes burned from the smoke. I felt dizzy and nauseated, deeply disoriented and afraid. All at once, I found it impossible to identify with anything my five senses perceived. Utterly alienated, my ego succumbed to a painful breakdown. On my knees, sweating with emotion, I struggled to connect something to the world that I knew. I failed. I felt totally disconnected. Although the dire poverty was disheartening, the people of Herat appeared to be the happiest, most carefree people I'd ever seen. This surreal combination of poverty and happiness short-circuited my intellect. Old men sat on the roadside smoking from large water pipes. The scent of the arid desert blended with the acrid aroma of hashish. The sights, smells, and sounds were disconcertingly foreign to my senses. I was alone in a culture where nothing existed that I could relate to. As I sat motionless on that roadside, a lonely alien in a distant universe, I prayed to be spared from this confusion. What was happening to me? What was the cause of this bewilderment? Why was I so affected? I grappled to find myself. From birth, I'd identified with my external surroundings. Not until this moment could I fathom the extent to which I had been conditioned. Just as wearing green-colored glasses tinges everything we see as green, so according to our surroundings and experiences, we have a particular perception of reality. The conceptions perceived by my body and mind had become my identity. Now those familiar conceptions had evaporated, casting me into a void. God, please help me. Who am I? Who am I? Who really am I? The world around me seemed to disappear as my prayer and meditation transported me into a state where a silent inner presence predominated over the phenomenal world. There I discovered a precious truth, a truth that awakened a sense of shelter and freedom. I am the soul, distinct from the world of externals, a child of God. The blaze of culture shock had acted like the rays of the sun to dissipate the fog of misconception. I felt liberated, flooded with gratitude. I knew that Herat would forever remain a sacred place on the map of my heart. Whenever I look back to that day, I am reminded how prayers may be answered in ways we never expect. To grow may require that we be shaken right to our core. While kneeling on that roadside in Herat, something died within me, giving birth to a realization necessary for me to move forward on my path. With each step, a camel lifts its hoof from a stable place on earth in order to move forward. And to reach the sea, each ripple of the river must let go of its present state to surrender to the current. As I walked back to my room, I came upon an aged man slumped on the roadside. Beneath his head wrap was a face defined with deep crevices and sagging with wrinkles. His toothless smile was radiant as he waved for me to share the hashish in his hookah. Smiling, I politely declined. His culture had already given me a high I prayed never to forget. In Herat, I was offered a ride by camel to a place where I could take a bus to Kandahar in central Afghanistan. The dilapidated bus was filled with poor farmers, and no one seemed to care if they paid the few cents for the ride or not. In the center aisle were sacks of produce, a half-dozen chickens, 2 sheep, and a goat. The straining, unmuffled motor, the laughter of men and women, and wailing of babies provided the soundtrack for this amazing show. Suddenly the bus stopped in the midst of a vast desert. In a moment, everyone got off. Was this an emergency? No, not at all. The passengers carefully unrolled their prayer rugs on the sand and faced the direction of the holy city of Mecca, performing their namaz, or offerings of prostrations and salutations to Allah and His Prophet Muhammad. Every few hours, this ritual was repeated with no consideration of where we were. The religion of these tribal people was their life. They were not mullahs, priests, yogis, or monks, but ordinary family people. Yet in all situations and places, it impressed me how their devotion to Allah took priority. In Kandahar, the people greeted me warmly. One man in particular, Hadiz, took a special interest in me. Tall and well-groomed, he was an educated man who had acquired wealth and respect in the trading business. Through his economic ventures and holidays, he frequently traveled abroad. After guiding me on a tour of Kandahar, he invited me into his spacious home. One quiet night, while we sat on his rooftop terrace, engaged in a philosophical discussion, he calmly said, "Mr. Richard, please excuse me for a brief moment. I have an obligation to attend to." Suddenly he jumped up from his chair, cocked his head to the moon, and began to howl like a wolf. "Awoo! Awoo! Awoo!" What was going on? Had this distinguished gentleman gone mad? He grabbed a long rope with a loop at the end, raced to the edge of his roof, and hurled it down to the road. What in the world was he doing? With rapt attention, he slowly reeled the rope in. To my amazement, he had fished up a wriggling rodent the size and shape of a ferret. I watched in wonder. This was a mongoose, which it turned out wandered the town by day and each evening responded to Hariz's howl by crawling into the loop of the rope, where he was hoisted up and spent the night on the roof. As my friend and I resumed speaking, I felt the mongoose scaling up my back with his sharp, pointed claws. He crawled under my long hair until he reached my head. There he burrowed himself in my thick locks, making his nest, and went to sleep. Feeling his warm body deeply breathing on my head, I experienced another kind of culture shock. I looked to my host for help. What do I do now? My friend laughed. Mr. Richard, he found a good nest in your hair." My neck felt as if it were breaking from his weight. "Please take him off." Hariz became serious. Under the starlit night, he sipped his tea and narrowed his eyes, warning me. There is an ancient truth. Never wake a sleeping mongoose. He set the teacup on the table and told me that the animal was sacred to the ancient Egyptians. The mongoose is a ferocious killer when angered. In battle, a mongoose will slay the cobra, the deadliest of serpents and symbol of death. Hariz sipped his tea again and leaned back. If you suddenly wake him, he may tear your head to shreds. Mr. Richard, do not even slightly move until he leaves on his own. Hours passed as I sat motionless, fearing for my life. From time to time, the mongoose moved, digging his claws into my scalp. Hariz could no longer stay awake, so with many apologies, he left to sleep. I sat alone now. The dark, sleepless night in Kandahar seemed never to end. My neck throbbed with pain, but I was too terrified to move. The mongoose on my head was like a time bomb that could explode at any second. I was quickly losing my attachment I had to my long hair. If only the immigration officers in England had acted on their threat to shave my head, life would be so much safer tonight. I tried to console myself. At least someone appreciated my hair. But the mongoose had not come alone. Ravenous insects started biting into my scalp, obliterating all these noble thoughts. Why was this happening to me? Feeling my vulnerability, I strained to control my emotions. Then contemplating, I tried to make sense of it all. I realized that our free will could convert a curse into a blessing or a blessing into a curse. Yes, ludicrous as it was, this mongoose may have been sent to teach me the sacred virtue of patience and forbearance. To bear difficulty and turn to God was a priceless blessing. To transform a crisis into an opportunity was true wisdom. The rest of the night was spent in an unusual state of gratitude. Little did I know that what the mongoose taught me about crisis would give me strength in the hard times that awaited me. By the time the sun finally rose, my uninvited guest had enjoyed a good 6 hours of sound sleep. He awoke, crawled down my back, and jumped to the floor. He then did something that moved my heart. The mongoose stared at me with an innocent affection, as if thanking me for my hospitality. Turning from me, he crawled into the loop of the rope where Hariz, who had just awakened, lowered him down to the street for another day. Hariz smiled at me. Mr. Richard, I beg forgiveness for the inconvenience you suffered. Nothing like that ever happened in my home before. But please be happy to know that in our culture, it is a pious deed to offer hospitality to an uninvited guest. You gave good hospitality to one of our mongooses, and you did so without any of the mechanical formalities. This morning, he looked so happy and well-rested. My aching neck, numb from strain and sleeplessness, I considered his words. Had I heard him say mongooses in the plural? I decided I really didn't want to be around the next time he cocked his head toward the sky and howled like a wolf. Scratching my bug-bitten head and itching to move on, I sighed. Hariz, thank you very much. You've already done so much for me. But I think I best be on my way. One evening as I walked alone down a quiet side street in Kandahar, a small man with one eye and one arm grabbed me by the hand. Pulling me through an alley some distance, he yanked me down a winding stairway. It was pitch dark. As we descended the crude stone steps, I pondered the mysteries that might unfold. Once underground, I was pushed into a dark, chilly dungeon. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a tarnished lantern shedding meager light. Its flame flickering on a crumbling stone ceiling and walls, where cobwebs and iron chains hung ominously. There was not a single window or piece of furniture. On the dirt floor squatted a dozen barefoot old men in soiled, tattered robes and turbans. They huddled around a shadowy mound. What could it be? As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it was a mountain of Afghani black hashish. Perhaps a couple 100 kilos. Back in Europe, I had been told that this was among the most expensive and powerful hashish in the world. The poor old men were continuously tearing chunks from the mountain and forming palm-sized patties for easy smuggling. My escort abandoned me to a corner as he joined the others in making hashish patties. How strange, I thought. What am I doing here? I probably couldn't find my way out even if I tried. Someone then rose to his feet and lit a flaming torch. Like a high priest on procession to the altar, he marched to one side of the room. There stood what appeared to be the venerable deity, a massive hookah. The man proceeded to feed the giant mouth of the pipe with kilos of hashish and ceremoniously lit it with the torch. Just then, another man rose, approached the long upward curving spout, and with all his strength inhaled long and forcefully until his lungs were filled to the brim. Then, removing his mouth from the spout, he exhaled, only to inhale another dose. Again and again, he forcefully sucked in great volumes of hashish smoke. It was beyond belief. Soon on its own, a thick stream of smoke was gushing out from the spout. Yet he kept puffing and puffing. It was superhuman. When he reached the point beyond even superhuman limits, his lungs revolted. Tumbling to the ground, he lurched uncontrollably, coughing so severely I expected his guts to come pouring out. Meanwhile, everyone else was nonchalantly rolling his hashish patties. Then the next man stepped up to the ominous hookah and repeated the same ritual. He sucked and sucked, perhaps 20 times. The smoke poured out from the spout, and finally reaching the climax, he collapsed to the earthen floor. Tossing and turning, he too coughed incessantly. Everyone in the room repeated this same unbelievable spectacle. When he'd gained control of his coughing, each man would calmly join his brothers in making patties while squatting around the hashish pile, giving way to the next victim of the hookah. Each man took his turn in rotation several times as the all-devouring hookah consumed kilo after kilo and smoker after smoker. I thought, these old Afghanis are certainly postgraduates in the art of getting high. In comparison, the proud hippies of the West are hardly toddlers in the nursery school. A dense cloud of hashish smoke hung in the airless dungeon. My eyes burned. Simply by breathing the air down there, I had become higher than ever before in my life. My turn had come. They pulled me up to the hookah. Was I to be the next sacrificial offering to their deity? A dense stream of hashish smoke was pouring out of the wide spout. How to approach it? I wobbled forward. I hadn't even reached the spout to begin sucking when the stream of smoke attacked my lungs like a serpent rushing into a mouse hole. To the ground I collapsed, rolling violently back and forth. Tears sprang from my eyes as I coughed so severely that I thought my lungs and throat were being ripped to shreds. Meanwhile, the veteran smokers slapped their knees, shook, and howled with laughter. For here I was, a young American, 1/3 their age, and I couldn't even reach the spout. This was their nightly recreation. But it was too much for me. I crawled back into my corner, slumping against the wall. Rushes of energy paralyzed my every limb, while strange visions appeared in the immense cloud of smoke. All sound was a strange music, and my mind seemed to be whirling and whirling beyond time and space. I could not move, and there was no place to go. My eyes burned with tears. Hallucinating, I watched the billows of smoke rising from the hookah, taking the form of ghostly demons coming to devour me. I reflected on the times I'd sought relief, happiness, or meaning through intoxication. What had I gained? My mind wandered back to the sight of the drug addicts and alcoholics I encountered on the skid rows of American cities. Acquaintances in college had succumbed to drugs, becoming helpless slaves to their addiction. I remembered a dear soul who went insane from too much LSD. An intelligent college student, she started chirping like a bird. Everyone was amused until she tried to fly out of a second-story window. A year later, she still believed she was a bird, but now chirped in the cage of a mental asylum. I too had at times sought peace through intoxicants. I was led to believe that chemical or herbal stimulants could induce higher spiritual perceptions, but I had quickly realized their limitations. It was an artificial state that drew me farther from my heart's longings. I had to move on. Swallowed by a cloud of torment in that hashish dungeon of Kandahar, a vow sprung from my heart. Dear Lord, I will never again indulge in intoxicants. I stumbled out of the room and onto the street, still reeling. One last evening in Kandahar, while in a dim, crowded tea stall, I squatted on the floor with the locals. Suddenly, everyone's attention focused on a blind boy who stumbled in carrying a rustic wooden instrument with a single string nailed across it. He was perhaps 16 years old, and like the others, wore soiled rags that loosely covered his emaciated body. My heart quaked. Nothing covered his blinded, disfigured eyes. Despite his extreme poverty, he smiled radiantly as he poured his heart into singing songs in praise of Almighty Allah as he thumped that one-stringed instrument. His sweet voice and sincere emotion hypnotized all 6 of us crowded in that tiny shack. An hour passed as the spontaneous joy of that blind boy lit up the room with a supernatural joy. He plucked upon his one string and cried in praise of God. I was moved. He was homeless, blind, illiterate, and poverty-stricken. Yet even in his humbled state, he sang of the vast treasure of joy he had found within his heart, his love of God. Kandahar had been extraordinary. From a mongoose I had learned patience, from a den of hashish addicts, temperance, and from a blind boy, spiritual joy. Grateful for all I had learned in that city, I bade it farewell.